The circulation just exists. A newlywed couple who can readily afford $83.33 a month to pay for a $100,000 home, which can't even be built in a $260 circulation, are denied that house, having to save forever from a circulation which only can represent what exists and has no capacity to represent further things beyond it, but by division, which is impossible, which of course is hardly to convey or abide by an object of stability, which is what Ron Paul claims. Now, quite converse to his historic claims, likewise, if we return again to Benjamin Franklin's paper, Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, we readily find that in fact, what Franklin reported is quite to the contrary of Ron Paul. He said that he reported that the colonies enjoyed far more prosperity once they issued paper currency, which allowed for a circulation substantially above the prior circulation limited to gold and silver coin. Well, there's a principle here. Now, Franklin didn't get his finger exactly on it. He speculates that too much circulation could harm us. Some amount would be proper, but he makes little effort to determine what that is. And furthermore, some lesser amount of circulation would harm us likewise. So his initial questions convey the need to resolve these issues to what they are. But the question is, what is the proper circulation? And the volume of gold, which is relatively static, doesn't just somehow arbitrarily meet the requisites of whatever the answer is. So what are the arguments? Why is it that gold is the material, or silver is the material, or plastic is the material, or platinum, or that paper isn't the material? Is it the material, as Ron Paul constantly tells us, or is it the obfuscation of the currency, which makes a so-called fiat currency or paper currency inevitably impose terminal failure? Well, if the Austrian economists, which Ron Paul boasts to be, were so adept at projecting these failures which Ron Paul claims they've projected, why is it that at von Mises' org we still have the article by Frederick Hayek purporting, it's actually a transcript, I suppose, of his speech in 1975, but he's advocating interest. He's advocating banking. He's saying that we can't have the same terms that Ron Paul uses today, honest money, unless banking, the production of the currency and the administration of an economy are taken from government and restored to private banks, which he simply says to which this authority belongs. But so stupendously absurd is the inaccuracy of this proposition that in 1975, under a Federal Reserve System, which is 12 private banks, which impose interest, which is what a private banking system does, Hayek is referring to the private banking system as if it's the federal government, which in fact it's only named federal. It's 12 private corporations. In other words, he's offering the preposterous proposition that our problems, which he doesn't identify, but which are a consequence of interest multiplying artificial indebtedness to the banking system, he's advocating that those problems are resolved by making the banks private, which they already are. So huge is this error, yet anywhere around us, even at Ron Paul's congressional offices, can you find a purported Austrian economist who recognizes the error and realizes then how 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 much this article only leads us into the very disaster that it purports to solve. And of course, like Ron Paul, true to the form of Austrian economics, so-called, there isn't a reason or principle proposed. So now, the question remains, does interest inherently and irreversibly multiply artificial indebtedness in proportion to its circulation? Is the principal really owed the banks? Or is it an obligation as in the natural obligations of a promissory obligation, instead to pay and to retire principal from circulation? If so, the principal is never even the rightful property of the banking system, the purported banking system, which are merely modern-day money changers. Therefore, there is no risk even which justifies interest, as I've explained many times. It costs across the world approximately $2 to issue $100,000 of, quote, money, unquote, into circulation. The question is, too, then, what is money? Is money merely a medium of exchange, as most people will answer if you ask them? They answer this hoping, in fact, that money is a medium of exchange. Somehow realizing, not in concrete or even irrefutable terms, but realizing more or less intuitively that if it's anything but a medium of exchange, somehow that would not be good for us. But the fact is, if money is anything but an immutable medium of exchange, as I've often explained, someone is injured when the value of money or property increase or decline. That injury is why we have to justify or engineer a truly just economy, which in fact preserves an immutable medium of exchange. After all, if you've committed to pay a contract in dollars or your own production, and the value of your production changes adversely as is detrimental to you, you have been injured hugely. And so this instability that a static circulation would impose upon a vacillating volume of industry and commerce is a huge offense against us, not a benefit. It never has been in history. The reason that we have resorted to the fractional reserve system is that this very inadequacy of a purported precious metal monetary standard imposes this injustice upon us. To sustain further industrial production, and of course we have sustained tremendous further industrial production even despite a terminal system of exploitation. But in so doing, we require substantial further currency. How much more? As much as the value of represented property. So this, in fact, is a crime against us that the purported Austrian economists, and Ron Paul in particular, are perpetually crying out against. Mr. Paul is claiming that we have circulatory inflation, that simply because the Federal Reserve is pouring money into circulation. It's issuing more money than ever before. But the reason that it is, and the reason that Ron Paul would be crying out for mathematically perfected economy instead of a return to the gold standard or competing banks or competing currencies, all of which are preposterous propositions. The reason that Ron Paul would be crying out for mathematically perfected economy, if he really stood against purported circulatory inflation, is that if you do the math, you realize the gold standard can't possibly save us. What is the math? How would $266 per capita save us? How would $266 per capita continue to service our debts, our existent debts, and preserve the value of our production, provide stability? What are the real answers to these questions? What kind of a people just assert that this would happen somehow without showing exactly how that would be to our veritable satisfaction? These are some of the most careless ideas which have ever been ventured. So we have to answer these questions. And if a candidate is crying out that the banking system is the problem, but he actually boasts of being an Austrian economist, which advocate banking and interest, which is destructive, which is the cause, the fundamental underlying cause of both the first and the second Great Depressions. And yet they're even proposing that they had predicted these events. By what? We can only wonder. They're simply not a credible authority. And so when we look at these things, we can hardly wonder why Ron Paul has had a bill which has made no dent, really, in Congress for blatant reasons. If you were given, say you're in the 5th grade, you're given a history project to write a bill to end the Federal Reserve System, what would you do? If you wrote a bill that just said, let's just bulldoze over the bank, hand the gold out to everybody, chop it up in little pieces, and be done with it, would that answer all the questions? No. What kind of a grade would your teacher give you? Your teacher would say you handed this paper in as a draft. Your teacher would, I would hope, ask you, well, excuse me, so why would you just give everybody the money, and how much would you give everybody? The same amount? Why? That might be the right thing to do, but if that's what you're going to do, assumably you have a reason to do that, and you've resolved that that is the reason to do that from all the other prospective reasons or ideas which we might conjure. What is the right thing to do? So is this evidence of even doing but the most rudimentary work which discovers that these questions need to be resolved? No. But this is all that Ron Paul's bill to end the Fed amounts to. It merely terminates it without even resolving, much less even identifying what the fundamental problems are that we have to resolve. What is the cause of the debt that we have? Is it just because people borrow too much? Can we just say, it's a false bubble that the Fed promoted? We blame it on the Fed, and yet we don't trace it unequivocally and absolutely to fundamental causes which are intrinsic to this so-called Federal Reserve System, which of course is 12 private banking corporations. We don't even trace it. We just say it's the Fed, and yet while we're saying it's the Fed, we're proposing that banks will solve our problem when banks are the problem. You see, this idea is just preposterous. it's irresponsible, and it can't possibly save us